thought this morning. So really, I just have a few slides to perhaps expand on some of the comments I made this morning. I think those of you who were here will know pretty much my view on this. So I just have a few slides to share with you. I suppose the human beings exist in an ecosystem. There's nothing particularly new or dramatic there. And the fact that the environment has a huge factor or huge influence in whether you are healthy or not is also important. We knew, for example, malaria, bad air, was described long before we knew about the Anopheles mosquito and the parasite. And the father of public health, at least according to some of us, pulled off that pump handle on Broad Street well before he knew about the Vibrio cholera bug. So the association between human health or human illness with the environment is pretty clear. And so we had a whole range of waterborne type illnesses. And as we knew more, we were able to control them, if you like, legislation, immunization, education, the whole shebang. I think the emergence and the burgeoning non-communicable disease burden is not so straightforward, and it's much more complex. I'll come back to that in a minute. I come from a tiny island in the middle of the Pacific called Niue. When I was a kid, if somebody fell out of a tree and broke his or her arm, most of us would say, well, he was careless or it was bad luck. But you know, my grandparents and people in the village will always say there was something behind that fall, that there was some supernatural force, something bigger than all of us was responsible for that event, that either family or somebody had done something bad to one of God's creatures, whether it's a human being or animal, and this is payback. And of course you might say, well, that's just bizarre. Johnny fell out of the tree because he was careless. So the association between human beings and the environment, at least for indigenous communities, has always had that magical, is the word I would use, because it's beyond anything I can explain. Association between humans and the ecosystem in which they operate. And I know, for example, indigenous Māori in New Zealand talk a lot about the ecological or eco-social basis of good health. It's not simply about your individual health, it's about community, it's about family, and indeed extended family while we're at that. And that's why, Maria, I've never been a fan of WHO's definition of health. It's a very mechanical, very Western, mechanical, limited view. Because what's missing from that conversation, from that definition, is the spiritual kind of superior force. I'm running out of words.
We can always change it, We can always change it. Let's change it.
Really?
Yeah, let's change it. Next World Health Assembly, we will propose it.
Very good. And so I suppose the point I'm making is that the fact that there's a connection is not new or interesting, it's just the perspectives that are brought to bear on this. So in other words, the relationship goes beyond water, oxygen, food, etc. It's much more than that. I also think that in a way this has been a reflection, that the changes that we see in the disease patterns in the world is a reflection of the fact that we've allowed ourselves to be seduced by the free market, freedom of choice, consume, consume, consume. You see, in small island societies, it's a very well-established fact. First, there's no such thing as a free lunch. You don't plant taro, you starve. You don't go fishing, you starve. But Pacific people and others have moved from the islands to places where they perceive quality of life and opportunity to be better. But it's not better. And there is this expectation that something will come to them, to us, with little effort. But I digress. The point is that there is a overwhelming pursuit of inequitable and unsustainable patterns of consumption. So we are depleting our resources, we are destroying the habitats, we are wrecking the environment, and increasingly for the benefit of the few. This is why we see the inequities that we see. And of course the population grows, and again, no major revelation there. And I do think that it's interesting that Peter called it the failure of governance. I'm a public servant, so I'm not allowed to use those sort of dramatic terms. But it is a problem of governance of sorts, that somehow private good, private consumption has completely overtaken the needs of the masses and a fairer distribution of the resources of the planet. I've already talked to you about the belief of small island people like myself. You do not take more than you need. So, Ecohealth. And as I said at the beginning, there are increasing concerns about human-induced climate change, resource depletion, ecotoxicity, loss of biodiversity, pollution, which obviously will have consequences. Reduced resource depletion would limit our access to water, at least in our part of the world, as I said this morning, from an already fairly precarious situation in terms of access to water. And climate change, again, with its own risks. I just want to talk briefly now about obesity as an example of the complexity of the non-communicable disease ecosystem link. There are still people, of course, who believe that obesity and diabetes is your own fault. You eat too much. And if you want to reduce the risk, you eat less or you eat more of the right things. But the reality, of course, is that obesity and diabetes is not a condition of the wealthy and the affluent that it used to be. In all parts of the world, obesity and diabetes is primarily a problem of those at the bottom end of the socioeconomic spectrum. And this is where the flaw is in terms of the arguments of people who say, well, it's an individual responsibility. Those of us, of course, who have a public health background understand that this is more complex. It's an interaction between individual factors and environmental broader issues. And this is where I think the ecological contribution, the ecological determinants is important. This helps us understand why diabetes is more common in people, in poor people, I suppose, if I could use that word. Because there's a whole set of interrelated things that lead to that. Generally, if you have limited means, you live in a community that's not so well established with resources. The school system is generally poor, and the food supply is limited, again, to poor cuts of meat, lots of alcohol outlets, but not much by way of fresh fruit and vegetables. And generally people are concerned in these communities because security is an issue. They can't get out and exercise. So it's all very well for us to think, well, you know, you just eat less, eat the right things, go out and get some physical activity and you'll be right. But of course it's much more difficult than that. And of course you're in that environment and network which reinforces some of these things. At least in New Zealand, where I used to work, there is this expectation that Pacific people who live in South Auckland will eat a particular range of food, and other New Zealanders would not be concerned at all that somehow this is not what we might recommend as a good dietary habits, I guess. So that's my trying to understand this ecological determinants of an example. I'm old school. In the old days, we used to call these socioeconomic determinants, but somebody smarter clearly has thought about this, and it's ecological, it's broader and so on. But as I say, I'm old school. Anyhow, so what do we do? I'm not sure that things have changed dramatically. We have, in fact, spent quite a lot of time trying to work these things out, but somehow it's a failure of implementation. In other words, there's nothing surprising about things like establishing a set of principles which we all can write down our own. For example, if we see some harmful practices going on in the community, then clearly stop that, either by legislation or education. Apply the precautionary principle if we don't have the full information. But the thing that intrigues me is that we've spent quite a lot of time as a public health community and others talking about health impact assessments or the impact assessments of various interventions. What happened to them? As far as I know, maybe in some countries that I don't know about, it's not actually being used. There's increasing application of environmental impact assessment programs for development programs, but the health impact, the health in all policy discussion, what happened to that? Why didn't it get legs? Why didn't we have traction? Because it makes so much sense to me. Before you do something that's potentially harmful to the individual, the community, or the environment, you should at least be wide-eyed before you get into it. But somehow it didn't get the traction that I personally would have expected, because I think in a very practical way, that is an intervention that's worth thinking seriously about. What's stopping us from doing the assessments that are required to assess the ecological, the social, the health, the economic impacts of a potential public policy, or more often than not, private sector developments? It's not being applied. And again, I think we've got quite a lot of frameworks, but somehow I don't get the feeling that we are applying these frameworks as well as we ought to. So I didn't answer your questions, Peter. I just thought I will share some reflections with you, because I do think we have enough in the toolkit. It's about applying those tools that we have. And certainly in our part of the world, where a significant development project is being considered, our advice to governments is don't do it before you've done an assessment. What does this mean? Because like individual health practice, we all mean well. And we forget the basic rule about first, do no harm, because we mean well and we want to do the best. But sometimes you do more harm than good. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.